Chapter 31. Ahead of Josephine was the border. Switzerland, a bright image on the horizon, hiding its bias under a flag of neutrality. The trek from the hive workers took Josephine 7 days, the 80 miles slow, but satisfying, every step one to vengeance, every one a step to justice. She would remember later the beauty of the Alps. Now, though, she felt freedom, and righteousness, and anticipated satisfaction. She still had the tiny slip of paper from under the lid of the milk she hadn't ordered in her pocket. The coordinates, and how Josephine wished she could have approached Collins in the Halifax on the flight just then to ask him, directed her to the little village by Lake Geneva. Josephine recognized the hand, Dudley Clark's writing scored into blotting paper. Money of many currencies and denominations that Josephine had stashed in her underwear had been helpful as she traversed south, through a landscape that seemed to be dissolving into its constituent parts. More than once she had to bribe a guard, though more often than not, the clogged arterial roads choked with Ostgruppen members and a silent, shuffling tide of refugees meant Josephine could slip amongst the tide of people and continue south. Beneath a heavy maki shawl, her hand never far from the cold, functional weight of the well-read silencer, Josephine moved, the urge to turn north and to find Druce and Galitzine and Barkworth tempered by her own part in the overall picture. Henry and Franks knew Eve was behind the deaths, and so the rest of them would. And they knew Josephine's zeal to bring the Algerian viper to justice. Near Annecy, she was nearly swept up in a flying court-martial, where the SS Fell Gendarmerie were pulling men from the columns to string them from telegraph poles for the new, invented crime of defeatism and had to hurry by lest she act with main fury and open fire on the leaders, but some of the men had had enough and opened fire on the captains who were killing their comrades. Josephine had slipped past the column and towards the forest that would be her cover until Lake Geneva, another peasant scratching for food and means of supplies in the death throes of martial cessation. But it wasn't just a usual traverse through woodland. The scenery was hard and tough, and more than once, Josephine was reminded of her maternal condition by a pain between her hips, every steep ascent forcing her to gasp of crisp, chilled air through her teeth, every uneven step a minute strain to her lower abdomen. Resting at a summit, which betrayed the landscape through which she still must pass to get to the inland sea, Josephine wondered at the paradox that she was a vessel for David's child which was being sustained by Bill's blood. This child would live, Josephine decided, and so would she. But she would think of nothing else beside her mission now, her icy necessity of finding the woman who had traded the lives of the 31 SAS women for her own survival. 88,888,888. By the time the silver mirror of Lake Geneva appeared through the frozen mist, the desperation of the interior had given way to a high-stakes game of shadows. Near the border, she narrowly avoided a German mountain patrol by lying motionless in the freezing bilge of a fisherman's skiff, her body pressed against the wet, rotting timber as the soldiers' jackboots clattered on the pier mere inches above her head. She did not feel the cold, she felt only the rhythmic pulse of her own heartbeat, counting down the miles to the village where the trail of Eve Mansour finally narrowed. It was in a lakeside villa, a place of damp stone and fading Edwardian grandeur, that she finally saw him. The local contact, a thin-faced man who smelled of wood smoke and old grudges, pointed toward the upper balcony. What felt like an age must have been only a few minutes, as Josephine stared up to the wooden balustraded balcony. There, silhouetted against the weak yellow light of spring in the Alps, stood David Sterling. No prisoner he, Sterling moved with the easy, familiar grace of a man who had chosen where he was at that particular time and place, his head inclined toward the black-haired, bronze-skinned woman beside him as if they were sharing a secret in a London ballroom rather than a nest of traitors. Josephine could only view them like that, as living game pieces moving about, with no clue she was there. For the sight of them together, the father of the child stirring within her and the viper who had gutted the SAS, sent a vibration through Josephine like tin past its freezing point, brittle and vitreous. Her bones seemed to crack and crackle as she stood upright, readying herself, as if Josephine herself would crumble if she did not prepare for the coming assault. She checked the action of her weapon, her mind a cold landscape of logic. She had come to settle a debt, and if David Sterling chose to be the hero and stand in front of Eve, then Josephine would have to face Bill and ask for mercy. 88,888,888. What Josephine noticed as she took one step, and then another, towards the villa, was the contrast with the visceral terror of London to the stagnant mirage of air of a Geneva cabin, the atmosphere a spent quality one of barriers up, a cloying sense like a wardrobe closed 50 years before, the clothing of a long-deceased relative left to the ravages of time and moths. Whale oil infused with floral notes of Eve Mansoura's perfume wafted down to her before Josephine ascended the lattice work. Despite its age, it held and she stood framed in the doorway, an apparition of retributive justice, the well-read feeling like a mere natural extension of an icy, singular resolve. She covered both the woman who had sold their souls and the man who had evidently bought into the lie, waiting until she was noticed, and Josephine was intrigued that Sterling did not wear the panicked expression of a man caught in a lethal pincer. Rather, he maintained the insufferable, airy poise of a grand strategist who expected a standing ovation for his nuances, his voice still crooning of Algiers and desert horizons. Much later, Josephine would recognize that her mind had known why, or at least who had been the director of all of this on the meta-scale. Now, though, Josephine saw that the man she hated that she loved was playing the rogue hero with such sickening fluidity that she felt the bile of 1,000 Highland winters rise in her throat. He truly believed, then, with the pathological confidence of the British officer class, that she would recognize the game. That Josephine would understand he was merely stringing the viper along to see where the nest lay hidden. But Josephine was no longer a player in David Sterling's theatre, she was the fire from the spark of ash discarded carelessly by the stagehand, burning the globe to the ground. Always the architect, David, she interjected, her voice possessing the clear, crystalline purity of diction instilled in her by Dudley Clark, designed for deception that was now being used for the most brutal of truths. Her gaze remained fixed upon Eve, yet her peripheral vision caught the slight shadow by the door, and she noted the infinitesimal quiver in Sterling's shoulder muscles. Eve Mansoura, a creature of reflex rather than rhetoric, did not wait for the dialogue to reach its inevitable conclusion. With a blur of silk and steel, she produced a small derringer and fired. The bullet whined past Josephine's ear, shattering a Ming vase into 1,000 shards. Only the best for this suave toxin of a human, she noted, scathingly. Josephine did not flinch. She knew the woman possessed a slightly crooked left eye which made her target sighting marginally, but fatally, off-center. As Eve fumbled to reload, Josephine moved with the terrifying economy of the doomed. The crack of the well-read was an absolute punctuation mark. The bullet caught Eve Mansoura clean in the center of her forehead. The woman who had traded British lives for Algerian dreams fell back into the cane armchair, her mocking smile frozen into a permanent mask of surprise. Then, Josephine turned the barrel toward David. Her heart was a sore, damaged thing, and her physical form was already undergoing a silent, internal siege. "How come you can't keep away from each other?" had been Bill Sterling's words, angry that his brother's reckless arrogance had trespassed upon her body, and more so that Josephine, despite her formidable intellect, had been unable to resist the gravity of his brother's magnetic, destructive pull. Josephine looked at David Sterling, in a clear, direct line of shot with her pistol. "Just to be clear," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, conversational whisper. "When you are dying, you should know this: your brother Bill has asked me to marry him. And I have said yes." The effect was instantaneous. David's face went bloodless, the arrogant mask finally splintering. "Josephine, a broken bar, no. Don't do this." She had no further words. She pulled the trigger. A hollow, mocking click. The chamber was empty. The silence that followed was more deafening than the gunshot had been. In a fit of raw, physical loathing, a rejection of the man whose child she carried and whose recklessness Bill so rightly feared, Josephine hurled the heavy iron pistol at his head. He ducked, the metal clattering uselessly against the hard, wooden floor, and before she could pivot to run, he lunged. His fingers clamped around her wrists like iron shackles. "No," he growled, his face inches from hers. "You will not do this. You will not marry him." "Not is a word you will never use to me again," she hissed. She brought her knee up with a savage force that disregarded the precarious state of her womb, twisted her wrists with a strength born of pure, maternal adrenaline, and broke free. She did not look back. She sprinted from the villa into the Swiss night, leaving Sterling standing over the corpse of a traitor. She reached a copse of trees and kicked a trunk so hard she felt a toe snap. The pain was a welcome distraction from the chaotic intersection of her hatred and her desire. She hated him for his arrogance, for the fact that he had left her to face a death sentence while he played at war. It was better, she told herself, as she clutched her aching abdomen and vanished into the shadows, to never think of him again, to cleanse herself of the Sterling name even as the biological clock Bill had warned her about began its final, lethal countdown. Josephine was in Switzerland, after all, and had a good deal of currency. She could get it solved so very easily, and then get herself to America and have a fresh start. 88,888,888. But it was then Josephine saw him, moving across the scenery of the villa. Dudley Clark. And when she had seen him, she knew exactly how it was that Eve Mansour had dodged death on 3 occasions, the last even being in a cell. Waiting to be hanged. Eve Mansour had been kept alive. Clark had let her run to see what would happen, see what David Sterling would do, see what Josephine herself would do. Could Eve have been that stupid she didn't expect an ambush? Or, had Dudley Clark played her so well, the woman had thought she was in charge? Mansour was dead this time, no acting, no effect could fake the cold, dead figure in front of her. Or doubt David's reaction to her. Josephine hammered both her fists on the trunk of the tree beside her and opened her mouth to scream with no sound. How she hated him, yet loved him so much. It was better, so much better, Josephine considered, when she didn't think of him, didn't see him, then she could cleanse herself of her feelings for him. 88,888,888. An hour later, David stood on the balcony, the fine tremors in his hands refusing to subside despite the cooling alpine air. Out of the long, violet shadows of the lakeside path stepped Dudley Clark, looking as though he were merely out for a stroll in Hyde Park rather than presiding over the wreckage of a continental intelligence network. How long have you known she was here, Dudley?" David asked, his voice possessing a hollow, metallic ring. "I since Milo sent the signal," Clark replied with a terrifyingly placid calm. It was piggybacked onto William Joyce's final broadcast. "I've had the villa watched for days. You played your part well, David. The arrogant renegade is a role you inhabit with natural, perhaps even dangerous, ease. If Josephine had succeeded in her attempt to kill you, I had her covered. If she had failed, well, I had Eve covered regardless." "Eve is dead," David said flatly, his eyes fixed on the dark, unmoving surface of the lake. "Of course she is," Clark shrugged, adjusting his lapel. "I have known Josephine since she came to my attention in Ireland when she was 14. She possesses that singular, Manesque quality: she will scorch earth the very world if she is denied what she wants." David leaned heavily against the stone railing, a ghost of a smirk flickering. "Like Paddy, then?" Precisely. "And do credit her with some intelligence, David. She counted exactly the amount of bullets she required into that pistol, not an atom of lead more, not a grain less. She never intended to kill you, she intended to leave you with the silence." "AGHQ wants to speak to you, Major." A formal debrief, Clark continued. "After that, you're free to go." "Go where?" "Not home." "Not to Kia," David laughed, a jagged, bitter sound. "I suppose that's going to be their love nest now?" "Billandithan?" Of course not," Clark countered sharply, his cane clicking against the tiles with a sound like a pistol cocking. "Bill is not looking for a love nest. He is a man of science and a man of conscience. He has offered her a sanctuary, a place to have the child before the inevitable happens." David froze. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the Geneva landscape blurring into a smear of grey and green. "Child? She's pregnant, you fool," Clark sighed, his voice dripping with a dry, clinical wit that cut deeper than any blade. "Couldn't you tell? Or were you too busy playing Lawrence of Arabia with an Algerian double agent to notice the change in her? The way she moved? The subtle, protective shift in her center of gravity? And you let her come out here?" David roared, the command returning to his voice. "In her condition? After what she went through in the Highlands? Fresh air and exercise, David." "Splendid for the maternal constitution," Clark said, his eyes mocking. He can't marry her." David began to pace the balcony, his boots clicking a frantic rhythm. "He's my brother. That's my—" He stopped, the cold, hard mathematics of the Colditz Chapel finally hitting him with the force of an artillery shell. "How far along?" 7 months. 8? About 5, Clark said, watching him. Bill is quite frankly horrified. He was the one who held her body to as Paddy stitched her back together after the first disaster, after all. He knows the architecture is a ruin. David stopped dead. The air seemed to leave his lungs. The first disaster? What in God's name are you talking about, Dudley? Clark paused, his eyebrows rising in genuine surprise. You truly didn't know? The winter in the Highlands, Sterling. While you were rotting in Colditz, Josephine was carrying a child. Your child. It died in utero at about 14 weeks. She was hemorrhaging, a limb had prolapsed, a broken bar. She was minutes from the grave. David's face went a ghostly, translucent white. the image of Josephine in the chapel, the way she had clung to him with a desperate, almost feral hunger, suddenly took on a sickening new clarity. Abel saved her, Clark continued mercilessly. Paddy performed a radical surgery, a fan and steel incision, under the most primitive conditions. He saw the damage. And now, he has to watch her do it all again because she couldn't stay away from you. He's angry. He's angry that you've condemned her to a second trial when the first nearly broke her. David leaned over the rail, his mind reeling. He hadn't known. He had been playing the hero, the prisoner, the strategist, while she had been bleeding to death. His blood saved her life last time. This time a broken bar, the strain a broken bar. 5 months, David contemplated, looking around him. That means a broken bar. He shot his eyes back to Dudley Clark. It's mine. It has to be mine. She won't say, Clark replied, turning to look at the dark water. But I know Paddy Mayne wants to hang, draw, and quarter you the moment you set foot on British soil. Whether the child is a sterling or not, you've managed to turn the two most dangerous people in the SAS against you. David looked out at the lake, the realization sinking in like a leaden weight. He had won his game with Eve, but in his arrogance, he had paved the way for the destruction of the only woman who had ever been his equal. Tell Bill. David started, then stopped. Tell him yourself, Clark said, walking away into the gloom. If you live long enough to see the wedding. And if she lives long enough to reach the altar.